right, so Develop It 7. I'm recording this before the holiday. Okay, so before the Thanksgiving holiday, here in the Wednesday of week 15. I have made a decision, and you probably will hear about this in attendance about the code up, and it's really going to cover promises. So, but what I really want to talk about this week, before I get into what I did, is answering a question that a student asked me. Because not every student is following along with the Firebase implementation, which is totally okay. But what I want you to know, and I talked about this last week, is that every develop it has a major deliverable, right? And because each of you are following a different path, right, this may look different for you. So that's why when you submit, you want to talk about what that, where you're at your deliverables in this case. So as an example, for me today, validation is something I still need to work on. But I actually ended up doing more of my capturing user data and updating the DOM, which was an important part for my app that I wanted. And I had already fixed my required here, which was a good thing. And I know by the time I do, and this is actually going to be, there will probably be a couple other, maybe one other video after I finish this, because you'll see when I demonstrate my app today, I still have some items to do items. Okay, so again, these have not changed. And for me, what I need to do is well document. I know this is something I haven't done along the way. I've been more just talking about the code to you, but for you, when you document the code too, it makes it easier for me to grade it, right, to see where you're at with that. So your program needs to gather, validate user input, respond to the user in some kind of meaningful way. It must be written in the module object method of coffee run, be responsive and functional and well documented. So again, this is a milestone. Make sure in your write-up you talk about where you're at with that. And next time is our last Develop It 8. It'll be the last one. Okay, so just that before I show you briefly where I got to. So here's my app as it stands today. I've changed a couple things. Instead of first name, last name, I decided to just do player, because really that's all I care about is the player's name. So when I log in, I can't log in with that player. And I'll show you this. I want to show you that once you authenticate individuals, you can actually just go in and delete them, which is kind of helpful because you keep using the same one over and over again. So I'll go ahead here and actually set up my player. So let's call it Kitty Matcher, right? Rio Waller, Rio Testing, and then so nothing new here except that I took that filled out, and when I did that I really could see how I could combine this into one, but I decided to leave it. So here's the other thing that's new, is that I now respond by grabbing the kitty cat matcher that was recorded to the database. And let me show you that. So in here, when I record, I write to the database. That's their unique ID. Then that's here. So when I present this back, it's actually it's not on the right, so to speak. When the coffee run displays the checklist, it's that it runs another function based on the data that it gathered in that. In this case for mine is actually going and getting it out of the database. Okay, so now you have the option here to start a game. It's nice to see you ready to play. So if I hit start a game, right, so then I can play. And I'll talk about one of the things I know I want to do that I haven't implemented yet. So we're getting, okay, so cool, that's done, and then game over. So what I want to do here is actually work on this UI. I got to work on how I want this flow to go. But what I want to show you here is that the gameplay, on that date, the start time and the end time was recorded. Okay, So how did I do this, right? So by the way, this is actually an issue right now because of where it's writing into the database, but I'll still go over the code that I wrote for this. Okay, so it's been it's so amazing because when you start working on this stuff and it feels like you've just done so much update, sometimes it's hard to kind of give you the overview, right? So let me come over to my main. So I implemented into my main on my authorization, on my on auth state change on Firebase. If I have a database user, I grab their ID. So then I go to the ref. So I create I grab the ID by looking at that UUID I showed you that gets created when they authenticate. Okay, and then I tell it look at this place in the database, which is basically players and then that unique ID, and then I say on this reference grab a snap, so it basically grabs that data. So then I can off of that snap dot child player name value, I can set a variable, and then I have a variable with value welcome text, which I've queried the DOM to get the ID for, and then I've updated the DOM. Okay, so that's how I handle presenting that data back, and I'll show you in a minute the other side, which is how I recorded it. But then I do some what I would call kind of just to get through, which is basically to show and hide some things. So once I've presented that user data, welcome, then I actually make the login not visible, I make the player not visible, I make the log out not visible. Actually, I make that visible because it's not visible, and then start game, I make that visible. So I just do this right now because I don't have a better way yet, something I want to work on for that. And if they're not logged out, if they log out, then I just hide some of those, reverse side of this. Okay, so then if I look at the remote player data where it's writing to Firebase, what's changed since the last time you saw this code was that, I'll talk about that in a minute, but when I add, okay, this is when I add my user, I create get the user ID I talked about before, and this is where I actually set up the player. So whenever I have a new player, I do set up the / player and then the ID, and so I grab because what's coming in is an array, and then I grab the second item on that array. So where does that get set up? It is the login handler here. So on the login handler on my create user login, I have 3 things in my array, right? Can say it that way. And then so on that click, right? So when they submit, then it grabs all those and it calls the function that has been set for the event handler here on the method. So if I go not on the method, but you get the idea. So it's when you on here, let's go over here and create. So this part of it hasn't changed, where I have create process login create. Okay, so this is my create user login that I'm calling that create player with that data. So where does that come from? And hopefully you're getting the feel of this as you're going through. So that's where on my play game, right? So that's where this is coming in, where I'm adding my player, and then I call the add, which calls what I just showed you before. Okay, here. All right, so that's that, and like I said, I added, so the login's the same. There's nothing new about that. I did add a log out, which I may have had before when I showed you. So now let me talk about this next part. So I felt like anyway, let me show it to you, and then you can ask me questions about it. So now what I did is I implemented a new module called gameplay. And under gameplay, it's very similar to the setup of login handler, but in this case, I'm actually going after a specific ID, right? So get element by ID, so I can reuse that here. I could have actually probably figured out a way to do it there, but I decided I liked it separate because it makes sense. So in this case, I have a setup, right? So, and that's where they click on. So an event handler, when they click on that button, so this is the button where it says start the game, right? So when you do that, we initialize events. And here's where I took all the code that I had had before, right, in my previous developed 1 and 2. And I ended up placing it in here right at the bottom, right? So I did the initialization, and this is all the stuff from what I did before. I did have to add a few things to it I'll talk about in a second. And so the one thing I know I could refactor here is making this more in the module method. So I know this is an area I need to refactor, but for now I at least got it working. And I ended up having to use those global variables, which again, you would only want to use those in your main. So I know that, you know, if I was completely strictly following it, but I feel like I still, you know, this is the only area I did it in. So I guess I'm letting it be okay for now. So anyway, so I initialize those, initialize the events, which basically sets up the game. And then I add the player, right? So I look at the, I'm trying to remember what that points to, not visible. So it takes away that where the user can choose, and then it shows the game in this case. Okay, so what I have done here in the setting up the game is I've called the FN. So what I'm in the main, when I have the setup here, okay, so if I go down here and I call start game, right? So then I do start, so I call set game start, right? So this is the function I'm passing it, so that after it does all those things, then it calls this, which is start game, which basically calls in the remote this game set start, which is here. And so in here, game set start, and I'll talk about this in a second, but game set start looks at today, gets the date, gets the time, smashes together the date and time, grabs the user ID, gives a reference to the database, and then sets that. Okay. Now, one thing, and I'll come now and talk about game set end, how I did that. But I know this is breaking what we call dry. Okay, so what you want to do is don't repeat yourself, dry. And so I know that I'm going to work, this is a refactor for me that I need to do. Okay, but when the user clicks start on the game, this is what happens. So now how do I grab the end, right? So in that case, what I do on the gameplay is down here when I'm checking for, so this is some code I added to my game so that actually I don't need to do today. Anyway, so here what I do is I set a variable called remaining cards, and I look at how many cards, and once that's equal to 0, which means I have no cards left, then my game is done. And then I set a global in this module called game done time, right? And then I actually make that end game not visible. I remove that on there. So what I'm doing there is I'm adding that game over. And that's part of the UI I need to work on. So now once that, so here's what I mean by that. Right? So this button right here. Right, so if I hit, and this is actually part of what I got to do here. So when I hit start game and I play and I finish playing, right, so a couple of things here, and I'll talk about is I know I want to refactor, but I at least got, so here's that's where the button gets set right there. it makes it visible so that I can click on it, but I've already captured the end time, so it's not when the user or the player clicks on this, right? It's already been captured. All I have to do here is this is just recording it into the database, which it shouldn't let me do twice, right? So that's where I'm at right now. Quite a bit of progress, partly because I spent most of the day just playing with this and getting it closer to where I want it to be, but I still have some things definitely I want to do here, but I'm closer to that. Right, so again, that's where this can, as you're looking at my output, we're all on a little different path depending on where you're at with that. But getting help is really, really, really important. Okay, that's why I've talked to a couple of you, and it really does help when you come in and chat with somebody, as I talked about last week as well. So my goal over the holiday is actually to fix my issues, my UI issues. Also, I need to present back to the user when they log in something about their gameplay, but in order to have that work, I've got to fix the fact that this is overwriting every time. But you can kind of see here, right? So I at least have close to it. I have the date, and then I have a beginning and ending, but obviously you want to be able to play more than one time a day. Right? So I need a way to kind of, I've got to figure that part out, and I'm basically thinking I'm just going to do an increment or game 1, game 2, game 3, and then capture that in there. But that's what remains to be done. Not remains, there's a lot more that needs, there's a lot more I actually want to do here, and I do need to do some more validation, and the validation I'm going to end up doing is actually on the Firebase side, because now that I have the required fields so that you can't just, and I will promise to end with this, let me log out, right? So I can't, ooh, that's, I gotta work on that. So you can't, right? So, but I'm not doing any additional validation, so I need to do at least here is to do a regular expression, but then there is some validation I can grab if, like as an example, if somebody tries to log in with, let me see if I can show you that. If I try to log in with an account that's not there, I believe what I can do here, right, there's no user. So this actually comes from Firebase. So what I can do is grab that and then reflect that onto the screen. There's a way I've done that, so I'm going to grab that and show you that. So that's part of what I'd hope to have done by today, but spent more of my time focused on just getting things to at least closer to where I want to be. All right, hope that helps you out. And there'll probably be one other video after this as I show you what I did over the holidays. All right, have a good one. See you later.